This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students, and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black Studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Tracie Canada, who teaches in the departments of cultural anthropology and of gender, sexuality, and feminist studies at Duke University. She is the founding director of the Health, Ethnography and Race Through Sports Lab and is the author of Tackling the Everyday: Race and Nation in Big-Time College Football. In this conversation, we discuss the cultural and racial politics of sports, particularly sports in higher ed spaces, and the place of those racial politics in Black studies and in the study of Black life. Good morning, Tracie. How are you today?
Hello, John. I'm doing well. How are you?
Surviving this heat, exhaustion, already 100 degrees at 11:30 a.m. on the 24th of June.
Yeah.
But I feel like just got to mark these things. If you listen to these podcasts, it's like week 2 after a fascist government came into power. Now it's like climate collapse is making it 100 degrees at 11 o'clock.
So going through a heat wave.
When the aliens come across the Black Studies podcast, they'll be like, it was really hot when John recorded this conversation with Tracie Canada. But all to say, welcome to the Black Studies podcast. I'm really glad that you made time for us to talk. I'm really interested to hear about your work because when I was thinking about this episode, getting ready to record this and sending you questions and thinking about it, I sort of reflected on the fact that we only have a couple of people in now like nearly 150 episodes that talk about race and sports, and that is such an important part of history and culture in the United States and globally as well. And so this is really, I think, a gap in terms of the kinds of things we've talked about on the podcast. So I'm really, really happy to be able to get your voice on the podcast. So thank you for making the time, and thank you for these, I think, what will be really valuable insights for the series.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate this podcast. I appreciate the work that y'all are doing. And I'm excited to contribute whatever I can to this, right? Like, because I think that we'll get into this, of course, but being an anthropologist, thinking about race, thinking about sports, thinking about the U.S., I think there is an interesting and unique perspective there that contributes to a lot of different disciplines, a lot of different conversations. So anytime I have the opportunity to talk about my work, but also to link it to what other people are doing, I'm always excited for that.
Great. Excellent. I'm looking forward to it. It absolutely will be a fantastic conversation. And, we will get into talking about your work and about the sort of study of Black life and how you see these relationships. But I wanted to start with a more personal question, which is, what drew you to the study of Black life? What got you interested in taking something like anthropology, questions of culture, of gender, of history and race, to as a way of studying Black life? Like, what drew you to this field? What drew you just to Black life as the field of study? And I mean that in, obviously academic ways, formative moments in terms of your reading and learning, but also this larger sort of question of how we come to these interests, from our very births.
Yeah. I adore this question. I love when I get this question because it allows me to shout out mentors and people that have helped me along the way.
I love names on the podcast.
Exactly.
So absolutely, please.
I love to shout out people. And part of the reason that I'm even more excited to be able to do that now is because I'm a professor at Duke, but I was a Duke undergrad, right? So like the people that I now get to shout out are my colleagues. They're not just people that, like I've been in contact with and I lost contact with. Like they're people that work down the hall from me now. And so it's a really fun experience to be able to kind of narrate how I got to where I am. We chatted a bit about this before we started recording, but I'm from Greensboro, North Carolina. And I have always, at least theoretically, been aware of this like vibrant racial history in the city that I grew up in. And actually part of it came from the high school that I attended. I went to Grimsley High School, which is like the historically white high school in Greensboro. And I was the first Black valedictorian of my high school. And so I think it was something that I was aware of when I was in school. But it became even more clear to me as I got older. But it was an interesting place to be educated, to be at that type of school with that type of history around students that were still, it's actually like a decently diverse high school, but the classes that I was taking were mostly white students that I was learning around. We were learning very particular things because I was in the IB program. So of course you're learning about European history and US history in a very particular way. You're taking philosophy classes, right? But, it was also very obvious to me as a Black student at this school that there was something kind of missing from the education that I was receiving. But I am Black. I have a Black family. I was around Black people a lot, right? So there was something that was happening in my own life personally that I wasn't getting in the classroom. And so there was this disconnect there. And then I needed to figure out where I was going to go to college. My dad has a whole thing about how North Carolina has too many colleges that if I was going to go outside of the state, I had to get a full ride because he was like, there's too many good places here. So you need to find somewhere in North Carolina. And so I found the most expensive place to go. So I ended up being a Duke undergrad.
I like that as a way of making him own his word.
Yes, for sure. And it worked out, it worked out for the best, but that was definitely his thing. And I have a younger brother too, and he also went to college in North Carolina. My parents both went to colleges in North Carolina, right? Like we are North Carolina trained, born and trained. And so when I got to Duke, I knew that I was going to be a Spanish major because I was in the Spanish immersion program in Greensboro, which is a program that starts in elementary school and goes through high school. So I'd been speaking Spanish for my entire academic career up until that point. But I figured that I needed to pair it with something else. But I had no idea what this other discipline was going to be. And so I would meet with advisors often. And the first person that I love to shout out is actually somebody who recently passed away. Her name was Lee Willard, and she was a dean at Duke. And I would go and talk to her, and she would just hear me talk. She's like, "You sound like an anthropologist." And I was like, "I don't know what this means. Like, I don't know what this word is. I've never come across this word. I don't know what this discipline is." And at the time, another Lee Baker, was also a dean at Duke. And she's like, "Let me introduce you to one of my colleagues." And so she walked me down the hall, and I met Lee Baker. And I don't even remember that first meeting, but he had to have said something to me to the effect of like, just sign up for my class, take my class. And so I think it was the second semester of me being on Duke's campus, I took Lee Baker's Anthropology of Race class, which I still didn't know what anthropology meant. I knew that I was interested in ideas of race because I was being introduced to them and thinking about them, but didn't really have any language to talk about it. And so being in his class was definitely the first time that I noticed intellectual conversations that helped me start to think about the things that I was experiencing or the things that I was noticing, thinking about the ways that like history matters, the way that power matters, the way that culture matters, the way that like experiences of like gendered experiences, racialized experiences with ableism, right? Like all of these things matter to our current life. But then because Lee Baker is a historian of anthropology, he was also putting a historical bent to it, right? To say that these things that are happening in the contemporary moment didn't come from nowhere. And actually, anthropology has played a major role in a lot of the ways that we talk about these things. And so to be able to think through my own experiences from what I was learning was an anthropological lens from someone who's thinking about the ways that the discipline of anthropology has shaped like biological, social, political notions of race, how pop culture has been influenced by these like deeply anthropological notions, how anthropology has played a role in he would talk about them as if they were these historically, scientifically racist ideas. But then, of course, it becomes clear that like there's these very strongholds to it, right? Like that's still something that's very contemporary. Being in that class was incredibly impactful, right? Like to be able to just think about this history in this contemporary moment through this particular lens that even at that time, I still couldn't really define what anthropology was. But I was fascinated by what Lee was doing. And so I declared my anthro major. And so I was in anthro and culture anthropology. Duke is very specifically culture anthropology. So I was culture anthropology and Spanish double major at Duke. And at the same time that all of this is happening, I am on Duke's campus as like a really excited first or second year at this point, right? Like trying to figure out where my place is. one of the reasons that I was interested in Duke in the first place was because of basketball. Being from North Carolina, but specifically being from Greensboro, where the ACC used to be housed, I had a very particular relationship with college basketball. Because every year it was a huge deal, right? Like, and I remember in high school, they would roll out the big TVs, and during March Madness and during the ACC tournament, we would watch the games in class. And it was it was a big thing.
Really?
Yes. The games were played down the street from my high school. So sometimes we would, if you could catch a game at the right time when school ended, or if you had enough money to be able to go to one of the bigger games, right? Like, we could go to the games at the stadium because it was very close to where I was in school. And so college basketball and the UNC Duke rivalry was like huge where I'm from, and especially at that time. I think it was my senior year of high school, UNC won the national championship. And so that was a big deal. And a lot of my friends from college went to UNC. One of my school, a lot of them go to either UNC or NC State. And I was the only person that went to Duke the year that I graduated. And so I had been introduced to this school on TV, kind of through basketball. I get to this university. I realize that I am actually not that invested in basketball, and actually I don't want to sleep outside in a tent to go to games. That is beyond my capabilities, right? So basketball wasn't really for me once I actually was there and I was seeing what was going on. But my first year at Duke, our basketball team won a national championship. And so what became really interesting to me was to see the ways that the basketball team was valued and treated on campus, because they were a thriving, very successful team and they won that first year, versus the way the football team was treated, which I was introduced to the football team because I lived in a dorm with half of the first year players. And so I became friends with them. I would go to games to see them, even though I didn't really know what was going on the field. And it was really interesting to me the ways the football team was treated differently on campus by other students, by faculty, by staff. There was this inherent information that was it seemed to be plastered on them of I know that you're a football player, I know that you're a basketball player, and I'm going to treat you in a particular way based on the team that you played for. And so that was really interesting to me just in general. But then because I'm already asking these questions about race, about gender, about class, about culture, about people, about the U.S., about youth, right? I'm asking all these questions. The thing that is really interesting to me is that I live in a particular body, right? I'm a thin, small woman. And I always have been. And so to me, everyone on these teams looked the same. They were just big guys, right? And I couldn't really tell the difference between the basketball and the football team. The majority of them on both teams were Black men. So they were young Black men that were walking around campus. They all were wearing Nike stuff. They were all dressed similarly. But there was an inherent value that was given to one team, the players of one team, over another. And I was fascinated by this dynamic because to me, none of them seemed any different, but they lived in similar, they had such similar embodied experiences that I was just fascinated by how tangibly different their experiences were, right? Their lived experiences on campus were. And so that was a question that I just started to think about more. And so I became interested in experiences of Blackness, of Black life in the U.S., but specifically on a college campus and on my own college campus, and even more specifically through the experiences of the male Black athletes on my specific college campus. That's how I entered into this. And so if at the same time in the classroom, I'm learning from Lee Baker, because he also became I think he was my advisor in the discipline, as you go through the major. So I'm learning from Lee Baker about race and the history of anthropology. There was another professor at Duke at the time, who's still here actually, he's Orrin Starn, and he wrote a book about Tiger Woods, I think my second year of college. So he's writing a book about golf and what golf means in the U.S., race, Tiger Woods after the whole scandal. I'm friends with these football players. I'm noticing what's happening on campus between football and basketball players. And so all of these questions are just swirling around, right? And I don't really know what to do with it. And then the more that I'm talking to these anthropologists, I'm there's something here, right? I can talk to people about their own experiences. I can learn from people about what it is that they're experiencing and maybe do something with that, right? And for me at the time, of course, it was still anecdotal. It was still what was happening very locally on my own campus. But there was still potential there, I think. Mm-hmm. And also at the same time, if you know anything about Duke's departments, but specifically their Black Studies department, I also was taking classes. I took a class with Mark Anthony Neal. He taught I think it was one of the first iterations of his Michael Jackson class, like Michael Jackson and Black Performance. So I took a class with him, and I took classes with Sharon Holland. And so she's like richly in like the theory of Black studies. But again, because this was not something that I was introduced to as a high schooler, a lot of what I was learning in college, I had no language for. I didn't really know what was going on at the time, but I was fascinated, right? Like, and I just kept taking these classes, and I just wanted to be around these people who were so smart and were saying things that were blowing my mind like every day. But for me, it still kept coming back to, this is an experience, like a tangible experience that not only I recognize, but I can start to see it in the people that are around me too. And reflecting on that experience, it makes total sense that I ended up being an anthropologist. It makes total sense that I ended up being an ethnographer, right? Because like I've always been interested in details of like the everydayness of the world, right? Like of people's social worlds, of like how people interact with each other, the ways that people build relationships, the ways that people are thinking about their own lives. That's always been stuff that I've been interested in. I just didn't know that anthropology was a discipline that I could like actually do something with that. And so even to add to that, like going to grad school didn't seem attainable. I also didn't even know what that meant, right? Like I didn't know what it meant to get a PhD. I didn't know what it meant to be a professor. I didn't know what research in the social sciences was, because I had a very particular idea of what research was, and it involved a white coat and like some chemicals and like some gloves, and like that's what I thought research was, and Duke does that research really well too. And so
I had
like,
that same image as a philosophy major. I was like, do I have to like do like labs?
Exactly. And even you saying that, right, like is an interesting full circle moment for me, because now I have a lab and it's a different type of lab, right? But that was the idea that I had. Yeah. And so Lee, of course, again, was the person that introduced me to this idea of being able to go to grad school, of being able to get a PhD, of there being value in the questions that I was asking, because even within the discipline of anthropology, I am someone who works in the U.S. I'm someone who looks at the experiences of Black people. I'm someone who looks at the experiences of relatively young Black people. I read about sports, but specifically about American football, right? Like, if you look at the key words for the work that I do, they don't actually make a ton of sense for anthropology. And when I was applying to grad schools, what made more sense, what people kept telling me, was that I needed to apply to sociology departments. Because Lee has a way of categorizing the two disciplines to say that anthropology studies the out-of-the-way other and sociology studies the in-the-way other. And he was like, you're working with the in-the-way other, right? Like, you're working with people that are in the U.S., on college campuses, rather than going out, which is usually what anthropologists do. But I was still incredibly drawn to anthro, and so I stayed in the discipline. I got admitted to UVA, and so I went to UVA for grad school. And if you look at the timeline that I'm at any of these universities, pretty major events happened while I was at these universities. And so while I was at UVA, I want to say I think it was my fourth year. My third or fourth year was when the way that I talk to students about it now is I say it's when the Nazis came to town. So the Unite the Right rally happened while I was on campus. The first year that I was there, also, there was a lot of messed up stuff that happened on UVA's campus. So it was a fascinating place to be as a young Black, like, blossoming intellectual thinking about these questions that I was thinking about. But also on the intellectual side, to be at UVA with the Woodson Center and like the people that are there affiliated with Woodson, the people that are there affiliated with African American and African Studies. I was a TA in that department. So what I'm trying to get at here is that like I'm getting sprinkles of all of this stuff the entire time. I'm like trying to figure out what it is that I want to do, right? Like in the questions that I want to ask, but I'm still completely committed to like, I am very interested in like the everyday lives of Black college football players. That's really what it's always been, at least since I got to college, right? Like pretty early on in college. And so with that as my center, I've been trying to figure out like what discipline, what methods, what questions, which texts, where is the information that I need to be able to ask like the best and most pertinent questions about this group of people that I think a lot of people don't talk about. They're highly visible, right? Like we see college football on TV every weekend during the fall, and it's actually pretty hard to get away from, even if it's not the season. There's always almost something about American football on TV being talked about with commentary, being written about on web, like there's always something about it. So it's a decently visible population in that way. But to me, like, what is actually going on with them is incredibly invisible, and actually that's for a reason. And so I was trying to figure out how to talk better about what was going on with them and their experiences. And so anthropology became the place that I could ask certain questions about power, about race, about history, about hierarchy, about violence, about exploitation, right? And then as I'm moving along in my training and my learning, and still now, right, like discovering texts in other disciplines like Black studies, like gender studies, like ethnic studies, to have conversations about labor, to have conversations about bodies, again, about exploitation, right, about anti-Blackness, about racial capitalism, about violence, and then again, this connection with history that is incredibly important, I think, still to something like football, right? Like, people are very committed to this idea that football is a thing of the now. Football has like a pretty interesting history when you historicize it, and it looks the way that it does now for a reason. And so I think that the way that I was trained in anthropology by a historian of the discipline has actually given me the tools to think about some of these ideas in a really interesting way. But again, it all came from, I don't know what I'm doing. I just showed up to college. I know one of the majors that I want. I don't know the other one. And here's like, go meet this person. And then Lee Baker ends up, and I tell him this all the time because I see him all the time now. But then Lee Baker ends up like shaping my entire career, right? Like with this, the introduction to this class and the way that he was talking about a discipline that I learned was incredibly problematic, but he was teaching me ways to think with the discipline and think against it also, but to do what it needed to for me.
Yeah. So just a side note, both Mark and Sharon are on the podcast. So
I love that.
Intra podcast, I always like to mention when these names come up. Mark was pretty early on, and Sharon was around 100 or so. Two fantastic conversations. But it's funny. There's the way you started and concluded the college sort of portion of that narrative is so interesting to me, because that's always what I want from students. I just want you to wander in not knowing, but being interested. And the walk through the door expertise or hot take on like what they're about to encounter is just I find that such a thing we work against in the classroom. And I think it has real existential consequences because it closes us off. I mean, I went to college. I wanted to be a psychology major because I thought it'd be interesting to know what other people think or something, like that. And I was in a great books program, and so I was taking philosophy, history, literature, and art history. And I had no idea what philosophy was, but I think it was exactly that made it so intriguing, because then I didn't have to fight anything, Yeah. And I think that in Black studies, I mean, anthropology, you're talking about anthropology, but also coming back, especially at UVA, to Black studies, this way students have such an idea of what Black studies is.
Yeah.
Right. Positive, negative, neutral, but they have such an overloaded idea. They're always surprised, I think, to learn that there are disputes about what the very term Black means. I'm like, hey, it turns out, you did not know everything as you walked in. But I like it. That's my own story. So maybe that's part of why I'm so affectionate, for this sort of, I have no idea. I felt transformed by learning what this thing was, anthropology, what philosophy, Black studies. But also, I think that what makes these fields rich is actually that naivete, right? Because then it becomes possible for you to think, I want to take what I can from anthropology to answer my questions, rather than like, I know what anthropology is and I'm like a partisan of it. Because every discipline or area of studies has partisans. And so we think better outside that.
For sure. And I appreciate the expansive potential of anthropology, right? Like, there's a way that I could have been taught anthropology in a very limited way. And I think that I could have also been taught anthropology in a way that made it even more inaccessible because of its colonial, because of its imperial, because of its anti-Black and racist origins and contemporary moments, right? Like, I could have been introduced to it in a way that was like in a complete turnoff of like, why would I want to be a Black student learning this discipline, right? Like, why would I want to contribute to what this discipline has done in the past and sometimes continues to do, right? And so I appreciate the way that I was introduced not only to the discipline, but then through Lee and then eventually through others, to be able to see that even if it's a discipline that is quite disciplinary, right? Like anthro is decently insular. It has like a very particular language that anthropologists use to talk to themselves. Now, having written a book and published a book, it's interesting to talk to editors and the ways that they talk about the ways that anthropologists write and how sometimes it just doesn't translate outside of the discipline. And it's not an issue that other scholars have, but it's sometimes an issue that very particularly anthropologists have. I could have been taught anthropology in all of these ways, but because I was taught it in an expansive way, and then because I was introduced to scholars like Bianca Williams, like Jemima Pierre, like Deborah Thomas, right, like Lee Baker, who are using texts and literature from other fields, not just citing anthropologists, not just staying within a very particular boundary, right? To be able to pull in texts from other people and other places, other times, was really interesting to me, right? Like, and the thing that I also try to do now in the classroom for students that come to class and they're like, what am I going to do with an anthropology major, right? Like, why would I major in this thing? And to an extent, I understand, because I'm like, I actually don't know if it's great for everybody to become a professional anthropologist like I am, right? Like, I don't know if that's necessarily what I want you to do. But do I think that anthropology can teach you how to think? Yeah, I do. Do I think that anthropology can teach you how to pay attention to the world around you? Do I think that anthropology can teach you to appreciate differences and potentially talk to people who are not the same as you, which I think are really important things to teach to students everywhere, but particularly students at a school like Duke, right? Like, I think that these are really important skills that anthropology can give you. So that's not to say that you need to go and be a museum curator, right? Like, if you want to do that, then that's great. That's something that anthropologists do. But if you want to like learn more about like your position in your own social world and in the way that those worlds interact with other people's, think about the ways that certain knowledge is privileged and like why is that and how can we think outside of that? Or like are there different people that we can be talking to learn from? Right? Like all of these things I think are really exciting about anthropology. And that's how it was introduced to me. And so I try to keep that going because I do think that there is potential to this discipline that has had a pretty messed up history and sometimes continues to be that way. And so I think that there's so much potential with what anthropology and also I tackle on ethnography with that. They're not the same thing, but I think of them a lot together, right? Like I think there's so much potential with what these two things can do. But a lot of that potential also comes from looking outside and bringing it into anthro, right? Like thinking with our own lived experience, thinking with the lived experience of the people that we work with, thinking with Black studies, thinking with gender studies, thinking with ethnic studies, going into the archives, staying in the U.S., right? Like reading different texts, right? Like all these things that other disciplines also do really well. We benefit from that if we do that as anthropologists.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'll use that as like a way. First of all, I'm always happy when people are like, no, you can actually learn something other than how to become a professor like me.
Yeah.
Hopefully. I love being a professor. I think it's great, but it's not the job for everyone.
Yeah, it's not.
But if our methods and our insights are worth anything, they have to illuminate something other than our own corner of the hallway, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But let me ask about how you think about your work in relation to the field of Black studies, and I wanted to ask this in the very particular context of the founding of the field that, Black studies has a sort of twin origin, one of which is the demand by students that there be a place on campuses to study Black life, that disciplines had not covered these areas, an English department, a history department, philosophy, et cetera. There's no place to study Black life in any substantial way. And that was going to be Black studies, right? A place where the Black intellectual tradition would have a home, where it could be reproduced, extended, and so forth. But that was also in the late 1960s, early 1970s, where Black liberation struggle had radicalized, and a lot of these distinctions between learning and action, between politics and the classroom, between community and the campus had really fallen apart and collapsed. And Black studies steps into that moment in terms of its demand to say we need to think, right, in between campuses and communities, politics, that it has a prescriptive dimension, that there's a political program inherent in Black studies. And so it has this this tension built in the beginning, right? The pursuit of an intellectual tradition and political imperatives that come out of Black study. And so I'm interested to hear you talk a little bit about how you see your work in relation to this. In particular, because I was just struck by your book having the word nation in the subtitle, right?
Yeah.
That on the
Yeah.
one hand, you could say, as you said, there's an anthropological specificity, right? Talking about how these Black athletes and college football athletes experience their lives on campuses.
Mm-hmm.
But, we can't get away, as you say, from college football.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's on Saturdays or now even like Fridays and Thursdays,
Yeah.
but also just the chatter about it nonstop. And so there's a national significance to it. There's something about the nation. There's something about politics. So I'm interested in how you think of the kind of research and the kind of ways you're understanding sports and race in relation to this origin of Black studies about being this sort of intellectual pursuit, which I think in anthropology would be sort of documentation of life, and the political imperatives that also come from that, that's linked to, as you say in your subtitle, this question of nation.
Yeah. That's such a rich question, and hopefully I can enter into it in a way that makes sense. So one of the first things that comes to mind for me is if we think about the history of Black studies and how it was founded, but if we look at anthropologists or people who are trying to get anthropology PhDs around the same time, because there have been at least two books, and the two that I'm thinking of have pioneers in the titles, like African-American pioneers in anthropology. There's like a first generation and a second generation, right? And one generation is post-World War II, and the second generation book is about Black anthropologists in the U.S. who are trying to get PhDs in the 60s. And so if we think of the history of Black studies alongside the histories and the like intellectual biographies of Black anthropologists who were trying to get PhDs in anthropology around the same time, we see something similar going on, right? That these specifically Black anthropologists who were dealing with the academy, who were dealing with anthropology departments specifically, who had these like really interesting, like really important projects and ideas that they were wanting to work on, who were being marginalized in anthropology because they were trying to do what Black studies was trying to do, right? Like this is an intellectual pursuit, and it's also a political pursuit. Anthropology is, I think at its core, is quite political, right? Like because you're working with people, you're around people, you're talking about power, you're talking about hierarchy. It's usually working with people, not thinking with the system, but like you have to be at the way that I think about it and the way that I teach about it too is to say that like I'm interested in the perspectives of Black athletes. I'm not interested in the perspectives of coaches. I'm not interested in the perspective of the NCAA. I'm not interested in the university, right? I'm interested in the people who make the whole thing go. Where if Black athletes, if Black football players decided tomorrow that they don't want to play anymore, the entire thing implodes. None of it works, right? Like that's the information that I want to get to. That's the experience that I'm interested in. And so these anthropology pioneers and ancestors are saying similar things pre-70s, right? Like they're talking about their own lived experiences. They're talking about the lived experiences of Black and brown people across the world, but also in the U.S. They're talking about the political imperatives of the work that they're doing. They are publishing their work in very particular ways, right? Like not just in journals, not just in books, but also writing newspapers and archiving their information, right? Like Ira Harrison, who passed away, I think, in 2020, he was the first archivist of the Association of Black Anthropologists because he realized at that time how important it was to keep track of what was going on, of what they were doing, right? Of making these connections with communities, of making sure that the people that they worked with didn't think that the work that they were doing was extractive, because that is the history of anthropology, right? Like as you go to a place and you extract knowledge, you extract things, you extract material, you go back to wherever you came from, you write sometimes in a language that they can't even read it in, and then you get a whole bunch of stuff based off of the book that you write, right? Like you have a career based off of the book that you write about these people in a community that is as Lee said, right, the out of the way others. And sometimes you don't even go back to talk to them, to follow up, to see how they're doing, right? Like that's the history of the discipline that I'm in. And so if you look at the intellectual biographies of the people who are getting PhDs, or at least attempting to, because not everybody was able to get a PhD at that time, right? Like not all Black anthropologists were able to. It's a really interesting confluence of the two disciplines, right? But as I kind of mentioned before, some of the people in anthropology that were doing this work that is very similar to what was going on in Black studies, the early years of Black studies, they were marginalized in anthropology, right? Like they weren't seen as anthropologists. They didn't get jobs in anthropology departments. They sometimes got jobs in the academy, but usually they weren't in anthropology departments. And sometimes they weren't even in the academy, right? Like they got PhDs and then they weren't able to be employed as actual intellectuals in that space, right? Like they became intellectuals and scholars outside of the academy, outside of the institutions that trained them. And so that's the genealogy that I am aware of, and that's the genealogy that I write to, right? And so then I'm thinking if in my own specific work, which my book is about the lived experiences of Black college football players. It's about the ways that they face exploitation against the college football system as a system, as an institution, right? It's about the ways that they challenge ideas of family, because the football, like quote unquote football family, is something that comes up a lot. So it's the ways that they challenge the idea of the football family. It's the ways that Black men, these young Black men, care for each other and recognize each other and support each other through this like pretty wild 4 or 5 years of like heightened visibility on TV, and everyone knows your name, and especially now social media, people can access you in a very particular way. But then every other day of the week, you're just supposed to be like a regular college student going to classes, and like how they, as individual young people, like manage that dynamic, right? Of the ways that Black mothers play into this, because moms are really important here. Or like, if this is what my work is talking about, I think that I'm situated in a really interesting way, specifically with these two disciplines, because I think that like there isn't, like I have been trained as an anthropologist my entire career. I ask very anthropological questions about myth, about ritual, about power, right? Like Lee would tell you that anthropology has thought a lot about race, right? Like what race is, what race isn't, what Blackness is, how pop culture plays a role in these things, right? Like I'm pretty squarely situated in anthropology, actually, based on the questions that I'm asking. But then to bring in these ideas of like the plantation logics of what's going on, the racial capitalism of the entire system, the ways that Black bodies are talked about and theorized and dealt with, right? And then to be able to, at least from my own orientation, to say that I want to write in a way that is accessible to everybody, right? Like not just to anthropologists, not just to people in the academy, but I want my mom to pick up my book and to be able to understand everything that I'm writing, right? Like that is a very deliberate effort that I made. For me to say, like I understand that journal articles are important for me to get tenure. I understand that the book is important for me to get tenure. But I think that going on podcasts and being able to talk to potentially different audiences. I think that writing for public audiences, right? So to be able to have my work in Essence, to be able to have my work in Scientific American, to be able to write for Time, to be able to be on NPR, right? Like I think that is, if not just as important, potentially more important for the work that I'm doing, because there is an important imperative to what it is that I think that I'm doing, right? Like this isn't work that needs to stay in the academy. I'm writing about people who are incredibly visible, who have very little, like the ethnographic detail of their life is not very well known. But also for me, I see them all the time, right? Like I teach them all the time. So there's also a very particular responsibility, I think, to the work that I'm doing, because they read my, like, and not necessarily the athletes that I worked with while I was doing research, right? But I interact with college football players all the time because they take my classes, because I see them in the hallways, because I go to games and I become close to them, right? Because their friends took my class, and so they hear about me, they hear about my work. And so I constantly have a mirror for the work that I'm doing, right? Like I constantly have people who are going to respond to it, not just in these public outlets, right? But also in an almost everyday type fashion, because someone could come into the class and say, like, I wholeheartedly disagree with the way that you've described my experience. I'm like, that's fair. The thing that I say back to them is that like I can argue pretty well. So if you want to go back and forth, like you're going to have to like come up with a really good argument. But I'm down to have my work be challenged, right? But it's because it has to be. And I think that that's really important to the work that some of the people in these disciplines were aiming to do, right? But especially at the beginning of Black Studies, right? To be able to say that there is intellectual importance to the work that we're doing, and it does need to be studied, and we do need to have these people, but also there's a political momentum here, right? And like there are real communities at stake, and there are real people whose lives that we are talking about, right? And there needs to be a way to connect with that. And there, like, I think that you had mentioned it a little bit as a disconnect, but the way that I see it is that like they have to come together, right? And so the thing again for me, you mentioned the subtitle of the book having nation in it. I think that all of that for me comes together because I'm an anthropologist who I think is saying something specifically about the U.S., right? Like I write about a sport that doesn't really translate outside of this country. People are aware of American football, but to the point that I usually, depending on the space that I'm in, I usually have to call it American football because if I present about my work, they think that I'm talking about soccer if I just call it football. Or like that is just a linguistic cue to say that this is not something that translates outside of the U.S., right? And so I am talking very specifically about masculinity. I'm talking very specifically about race, about violence, about spectacle, but all through a very particular U.S. gaze, right? Like in a very particular U.S. context in a way that it doesn't even make sense anywhere else. And so I think that putting all of those things together does make it important for me to write in a way that other people that are not in the academy can read, right? I do think it's really important for me to publish in places that are accessible and that you don't have to buy them, right? Like you don't have to buy my book in order to get at some of the arguments that I'm trying to make. You can download a podcast or you can just log onto a website, right? And I understand the importance of some of what the academy requires of us as academics. But I think that my work would be limited if it stayed in the academy. And so I'm trying to be in conversation with ancestors and pioneers and more later like late stage career anthropologists who have always been doing this work because this isn't new, right? Like what I'm doing is not new at all. So I'm trying to be in conversation with people who have been doing this work since Black people have been getting PhDs in anthropology, because they are the people who have consistently recognized the importance of bringing in these other disciplines, of bringing in other methodologies, of bringing in other ways of thinking of and with people that we work with, right? And so I'm just trying to replicate that, but specifically in work that is thinking about Black college football players and their lives as young Black people in the world, and specifically in the U.S. now.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's really interesting. I mean, I was, you really got to the heart of a lot of things, right? This complicated, but in a really productive way, I think really a complicated part of the history of Black studies, which is a commitment to a sense of community, but also a commitment to intellectual life. And so like speaking really to that as an imperative of Black studies, it's an imperative of other things as well, but I think it's particularly poignant and urgent in the case of Black studies, because as you said, in so much of what you've been talking about, right, that these athletes are places where so much is negotiated financially, culturally, and politically. And so what does it mean to not have documentation of their lives, right?
Yeah.
As a part of Black life. And I also really appreciate how you've, I think, described in really great detail how it pushes the boundaries of anthropology, but also pushes the boundaries of Black studies. And so like sort of on that note, I'll try to ask this in a way that doesn't just, so that you don't just say what I just said, although that would be part of your answer. But I am interested, you said this when you were talking about, taking courses with Sharon and Mark as an undergraduate at Duke, about how they had I think you used the word sprinkled, or maybe that's my word, but sort of given you like these little bits and pieces of vocabulary that you weren't getting in anthropology, because anthropology had this other vocabulary, which was giving you all this depth of engagement, but that these African-American studies classes and professors were giving this other vocabulary. And so what's interesting to me about the kind of work that you do and the way you're talking about it is how, on the one hand, you have this disciplinary training and anchor in anthropology or cultural anthropology, but you also have worked, whether it's at the Woodson Center or these other courses and this vocabulary and the political and intellectual imperatives of Black studies. You also mentioned, working in gender studies. And so you have this sort of positioning of your own work as a writer and I assume as a teacher between a discipline and this non-disciplinary approach to talking about things. And so I'm interested to hear you talk a little bit about how you think that relationship between disciplines and non-disciplines, area studies, whatever we want to call them, how that relationship has informed what you write, how you write. But also I'm always interested in hearing how it's impacted how you construct a classroom.
Yeah, I think about this a lot because to your point, right, like I have been trained only in anthropology, which is incredibly disciplinary, is very insular. But I, as an example, especially like to tag onto this question about classes, right, like all of my classes at Duke so far have been cross-listed with women and gender studies, um, uh, with African American studies, with we have a department that's called International Comparative Studies, with sociology, right? Like, and so I get students from all over that come into my classes. And more broadly, I think of the classes that I teach as like I teach a sport class, I teach a class about Lovecraft Country, like the show. I teach a class about I teach a class called Black Ethnographers, so thinking expansively about what it means to be an ethnographer, but then also what it means to be a Black ethnographer in the U.S. Most of the people that we talk about are in the U.S. And then I also teach about, I teach a methods class. I teach a class about, it's called Black embodiment. And so like what it means to think about Black bodies over time and space, right? So like even though the work that I do as an anthropologist of sport, which sometimes I'm even hesitant to say that about myself, right? Like I don't necessarily write about sport. I write about the experiences of specific athletes, but the experiences that I write about those athletes are about race, are about gender, are about labor, right? Like, so I don't necessarily think of myself all the time as someone who's only thinking about sport. But if I were to use that, sports studies is actually very interdisciplinary as well, right? Like, so if you think of people that write about sports, you have them in history, you have them in sociology, they're in anthropology, sports management, right? Like there are some English folks that are writing about athletes, right? Like, so they're everywhere. Communications, media studies. So sports studies itself is very interdisciplinary. Black studies and gender studies are interdisciplinary. And anthropology is like kind of just sitting on its own, like pretty grounded in what it is that it's doing, what it has been doing for a very long time. And so the way that I like to think about how all of this stuff comes together for me in my head is kind of the ways that I was taught these things. And to go back to Mark and Sharon's classes, they're straight up like Black studies people, right? And it's not that their classes weren't that, but I think that being a student in those classes and coming in with the experiences that I had and never having the opportunity to put a language to the things that I was noticing and to even hear snippets of it, right? To be able to read things that I was like, oh, like this was written in the 70s, but this is very similar to what I'm going through now. Or this movie, Mark is like great for books, of course, but like music and movies, right? Like, so he'll just pull out like a random song. I'm like, oh, like this song is like really speaking to a very particular experience that sounds incredibly familiar, but the song is from the civil rights movement, right? Like the ways that both of them were able to introduce me slowly, and I say slowly not because of them, but because of me, because of how I was oriented at the time, right? For them to introduce me to these things, to then say that like I can broaden the way that I'm thinking about this topic, right? Like I do not need to be limited by this. So there are other approaches. There are other ways of thinking about this. And if I think more expansively about it, then of course that's also going to open up the world that I am interested in. It's going to open up the world that I am seeing in the experiences of the people that I want to write about, that I want to learn about, that I want to learn from, right? So I think that being introduced to all of these different ideas and these different thinkers, and also something else that I think is really important about the work that I do now, but had to have come from probably somebody like Mark, right? To be able to think about music, to be able to think about art, to be able to take seriously what ESPN is writing, right? Like, so what journalists are writing about, to think about the digital world and like what's happening online, right? Like all of these things always come into what it is that I'm doing. So that definitely did not come from anthropology, right? And I give credit to plenty of other disciplines for my ability to pick up on those things. But then also, if I'm thinking more expansively and I bring in not just Black studies text, but then also Black anthropologists who are taking Black studies seriously, and a lot of them are also having like a Black feminist approach, a Black feminist pedagogy to what it is that they're doing, to then incorporate that into what I'm doing, then that's to say that, like, okay, I can be really specific about the ways that I write about caring masculinity, right? Like, which is something that I do write about, right? Like the ways that these young Black men who play football are potentially, and in a way that's like unexpected, are caring for one another, right? Like that have these quite intimate relationships with one another. Who take time to really think with and listen to each other, right? Like in ways that that's not what's usually talked about when people are talking about Black college football players. To be able to highlight the like really beautiful and like really important relationships that these young men have with their mothers, to be able to think about how different forms of kinship arise for football players, right? Like to be able to challenge this idea of family, I don't think that would just come from me sticking solely to anthropology texts. I think it's impossible for that to have happened, right? It had to come from me recognizing my own positionality as a Black woman being in this space. It had to come from me being critical of anthropology as a discipline, which situates me with other Black anthropologists who have used other disciplines to be critical of anthropology, right? Like it had to come from me being able to pay attention to sometimes the nuance of what people were saying and how they were acting, because it didn't always align with what I was expecting, right? But that's the idea of taking seriously what people are showing you, right? Like it's not what you expect, but it's real. And because people are theorizing their own lives and we have to take that seriously, then like that's what I have to write about, right? Like that is what I write about, and that is what I'm interested in. That's what I became interested in. And so like there's a way that I'm able to use these more interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary fields, right? Like to contribute to the thing that I am pretty squarely situated in, but then to bring that into the classroom as well, right? Like to introduce texts from lots of people, but to introduce texts that aren't just in academic journals, right?
Yeah.
So we'll listen to podcasts, we will watch documentaries, we will read sometimes like the shorter version of somebody's book if they publish it in a public outlet. Like we'll read a lot of those, right? Like to get at the ideas, but you don't have to read an entire book in order to get that. I'm pretty committed to that idea, right? And a lot of that comes from the way that I've been exposed to Black studies, right? Like it's not just the language of the field, but it's also the way in which scholars in this field are doing their work, the way in which scholars in this field are showing their work, right? The ways that and this comes from anthropology, the way that anthropology has historically thought of Black and brown people as research subjects rather than knowledge producers, right? Like to be able to flip that on its head, to say that like, no, they are producing knowledge. It just might not look the way that you expect it to look, right? Like it might not be written in a book, it might be in a song, but there's still something there, right? Like, and that's something that's worthy of study. And to be able to incorporate that in all of my classes, and what actually allows me to do that is because my classes are cross-listed, I don't just get anthropology majors. I actually very rarely get straight up anthropology majors, right? And so when I get a classroom that is a seminar, so like usually less than 20 students, but they come from all over campus, right? Like all disciplines. And sometimes, I don't know if I've had an engineering student yet, but our Duke's campus is for undergraduate education, it's the School of Arts and Sciences, and then it's the College of Engineering, right? So like I don't think I've had any engineers yet, but I've definitely had students from the natural sciences come and take my sports class, right? And they might come into an anthro sport class and think that they're going to get information about the ways that different sports are played in different parts of the world, right? Like the history of these different sports. I'm like, you could get that somewhere else. There might be somebody on this campus that's teaching that, right? But that's not what you're going to get here. Like we're going to do like a deep dive and a very critical, we're going to look very critically at this thing that you clearly love, right? Like that's why you took this class, is because you're so invested in sports. And a lot of them are also very invested in basketball because we're at Duke. But no, I want you to think about the way that that like trans athletes have been excluded from certain participation. I want you to think about the ways that the history that universities tell about themselves actually impacts the sports that are played on their campus, right? Like, I want you to think about what it means for you to be kind of a blind fan of the things that are going on. And specifically in college sports, when we think about all of the money, just like based off like just a random example, right? Like if we think of all of the money that is involved in college sports and you love it and you go to all the games and you are this like huge fan, right? But you're not actually thinking about the experience of this player who is actually your classmate and is sitting beside you right now. Like you're not actually thinking about her experience on the field, right? Those are the things that I want my students to get at. And I have the flexibility to do that because they're coming from all over campus and because of the ways that I incorporate all sorts of things in my classes. And I also am very deliberate in most of my classes too. We start with a section, every day we start with a section of like in the news, right? Like, so if something is happening, if something is going on, if they read something in the sports classes, if there was like a big game, if there was something that happened at a game, I want them to bring it in and I want us to analyze it. I want us to critique it because I think that that is important. I think that that's important, especially for something that they clearly are incredibly invested in. And even if it's not the sport classes, to be able to say, like, these things that are going on theoretically out there do impact you here while you're still in college, do impact you while you're on this college campus, and are very clearly going to impact you when you leave, which isn't too long from now. You could be a first year, but you're going to be out there in 3-4 years, right? Like, so I want you to be able to think about what's happening in the real world outside of your college space, to connect that to what's happening with you now, but also with what you're reading, with what you're seeing, with what we're learning about, with what we're analyzing. And so like that ability, to me, I think that ability to be able to do that and to do it pretty seamlessly, right? Like that is now second nature to me, even though I haven't been teaching for that long. I think the other thing that's interesting about this is that I've only been teaching in a post-COVID world, right? Like I got my PhD in 2020. So I don't know what it was like before students were okay with Zoom. I don't know what it was like before certain accessible technologies were almost mandated in certain classes, right? Like that's not the world that I grew up teaching in. And so I have very particular relationships to my students and to the ways that I teach them because of all of these things swirling around together, right? But I do think that it's important to highlight that post-COVID moment because I don't know what it was like pre-COVID. I don't know what students were like. I don't know what teaching was like, but I know that the ways I have come to interact with my students picks up on, I think, a lot of what they're now exposed to and what they're used to and hopefully what they're interested in, to be able then to say, this will be useful to you when you leave this place because you are all going to eventually leave this place and you need to leave with something. And it might not be a job. I can't get you a job. And to my point from before, I don't know if I would tell you to be a professor, but I can give you some skills to go out into the world and not be a horrible person. And that's actually what my goal is here.
To not be a horrible person. I think that's I think at this point that's a massive aspiration and good one. No, pre-COVID, pre-Zoom was better. Accessible technologies is an improvement of the last 10 years, but boy, do I miss students not saying, could we just do this on Zoom or could you just record it for me? But I won't go down that path. But I just wanted to comment. I mean, there was something really wonderfully political about your comment with the students. You know, what does it mean to be invested in this thing and not know anything about the lives of someone who's next to you, literally or figuratively? Mm-hmm. And I think that the way the mixture of culture and spectacle has such a deep political impact on our inability to understand that this person is right next to you, right? You know, literally sometimes in a classroom or figuratively in that we exist in the same world. I mean, that's the original meaning of politics, right? Is the question of what it means to belong together in those moments when, you know, I call it, you know, these similar kinds of things. I don't teach on sport, but similar types of moments, especially around class, talking about, you know, the unexpected belonging, like these things that we don't think we belong to, but we actually do. And what does it mean to discover that? And how are we transformed by those moments where the stories of the people we didn't know we belonged to and belonged with, but we do. Right. I think those are transformative moments for students in the way that you just concluded, which is it opens up a fairly straight, wide path to not being an awful person.
Hopefully, right?
Yeah. And it's just my personality. I like to drown them in guilt. It's just like you move your little finger, you're complicit in the murder of thousands, but also by your own ignorance in the technical sense of ignoring, like creating a false distance from those with whom we're intertwined, right? Alienates us from all sorts of political possibilities. And sports is real, and people lead real lives. They're injured. They have passions. They have meaning. As you said, they have intimacy. I think that question of intimacy is just so interesting and important. So anyway, sorry, I'm just like riffing off of what you said, but there's so much there that I think is really interesting. And in some ways, I have a last question for you. I think you probably have said this a few times, but I'll ask it anyway.
Yeah.
But just thinking in the context of Black studies or the study of Black life, what is the question you would want us to all be asking, or the issue you would want us to all think about?
Ooh. I have an answer. One is going to be very sports specific, and then the other one is going to be more broad.
Is it going to be is it going to be more than one question or issue? Because I'm still looking for someone who just has the one. They're always like, I have a few.
No, it's going to be more than one. But I can make the first one quick, and it's only because it's picking up on something that you just said about injury and being like how that factors into sports. Actually, I think that one of the things that needs to be thought of, and this goes to like us not being horrible people, is also like recognize the humanity and the realness of potentially the person that's beside you or theoretically beside you. The ways that injuries factor into the experiences of athletes in general, but football players specifically, even more specifically college football players, and the way that aligns with like gambling, the way that people talk about like value of people's bodies and who they are. That is a conversation that continues to make me uncomfortable. I think it's gross. I think that people need to really reconsider the ways that they talk about athletes and their bodies and their abilities and their performances on a field, specifically because of how injury comes into that and what that tangibly means for the person that they're talking about, right? Athletes become abstractions, and they are dehumanized in that way. They become just objects, right? Like on a board in some way. And this can come from fantasy. This can from fantasy leagues. This would also come from gambling, right? But this idea that these are not people is clearly not true. And when you're talking about them in those ways, like that's a conversation that just really needs to be dismantled and rethought. And that's like a pretty widespread conversation, right? Like not just with football, but with all sports, the ways that injured athletes are discussed or performances that athletes have after games, I'm very uncomfortable with. But I think that that's a question that we need to be asking, right? It's like the way that we place values on people, the way that we place value on athletes' bodies and how they live up to that or they don't. And then how that is incorporated into our own everyday language. The broader question that I will say is more about this everydayness, because that's something that I am incredibly interested in. I think that is incredibly important. I write about something that has these spectacular moments, right? Like a game is a spectacular moment. It's a pretty regular spectacular moment, but it's outside the norm, and it's extravagant, and it's a spectacle, and there's a lot of eyes on it, and there's a lot of time and effort that goes into it. But I like to situate my work and but what's happening on the Tuesday for a college football player, and I think that question of what is it that we come across in our everyday life that needs to be questioned, that needs to be better analyzed, that needs to have more people paying attention to it. What is that thing that we kind of just don't critique, that we kind of it just goes unquestioned? It could potentially be a thing that we love, but we're not actually thinking critically about it. Those are the moments that I think need to be incorporated more into whatever it is that any of us are doing. And I think that that's in the academy. I think that that's as scholars. And I also think that that's just as people living in the world. So then we're not, horrible people out here. What is this, this texture of the everyday, and recognizing it and being able to distinguish it and being able to talk about it eloquently and theoretically and in a smart way. I actually think that a lot can come out of that, right? Yeah, I think that sometimes scholars are really invested in these big moments, these things that, a lot of spotlight is on. But I really I'm just much more interested in these quiet, everyday, mundane things and the people that make those things go, right? Because things don't just happen. There are people that are behind them usually. But they're hidden and they don't get a lot of shine and people aren't talking about them. And in the world that I'm in, right, like people aren't putting a microphone in their face. ESPN isn't writing a story about them, but without them, the whole thing doesn't go. And so I think that I don't know if this is even answering the question the way that you wanted it to be answered.
No, it absolutely is.
That's the thing that I appreciate that. That's the thing that I am always concerned with. And that's the thing that I always try to leave my students with who come through any of my classes or come to office hours or anything like that, is to say that, like, what's this thing maybe that's so small that seems really small, but probably isn't. Right. And how can we rethink that? How can we challenge that? How can we go along with it? Right. Like maybe you just don't know a lot about it. And I think that finding out more about those little everyday, potentially small things can uncover a lot and can give us a lot of information and can actually get us invested in different things, get us invested in different people, in different ways of living, of understanding what's going on more broadly, right? Like not being so insular on our own individual things and problems. And there's a lot of potential there. And hopefully, like I think it could, I don't want to say like fix the world's problems because I don't think it'll do that. But there's potential in focusing on those small things. And I think that if we all did that and asked questions about that, we'd be in an interesting, potentially better place.
I love that. I have to say, I mean, it's pushing all sorts of positive things for me around this notion of the everyday. I'm a critical theory person, and my students often laugh at how I can take, the most random thing in the world and act as an example of explaining what seemed in the text or in the initial conversation to be this really dense theoretical thing. And I'm like, well, the theory is in the world. Right.
Yep.
The information is there, whatever, as a theorist, you say theory, anthropologist, information, story, et cetera. If it's in the world, then we have lots of different ways of talking about it. But the fact that it's in the world also, and I like the way you frame this as it also infuses us with new existential possibilities in terms of the kind of people we are, but also political possibilities in terms of how we belong to each other in new and different ways when we understand you don't have to build this bridge. It's already there, right? Yeah. It's already a relation. So it's a wonderful place to conclude, Tracie. I was really excited for this conversation. This has just been a fantastic contribution to the series. I'm happy that you made the time. Really, really grateful for your thoughtfulness because this has been really smart and interesting, and absolutely thrilled to have it as part of the Black Studies podcast. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been great.
All right. Well, have a good rest of your day. Take care.
Thank you. You too. Stay cool.
Yeah, you too. Bye-bye.